Hello and good morning. Welcome to B Cube Sunday morning. My name is Bob Brown. I have the privilege of running B Cube Press, and more importantly, I have the privilege of knowing some of the Smoths in the world. I know Smoths because he's currently at SmothCon. Smoth being an acronym, nerds love acronyms, for the Secret Masters of Fandom. Former World Con chair. You are a former World Con chair.
Yes, I am.
How many of them?
Only one. There's only one person alive who has chaired 2 World Cons.
Yes, well, and if you did it, they'd probably have to come after you. But all I know is that Tom knows the best people, and he brings the best people he knows onto B Cube Sunday morning. And so let me just say that it's a pleasure to have you, Tom, and I'm going to go back and watch from the background.
All right. We will see you all anon. Good morning, everyone. This morning, I was at Oricon a few months ago, and I ended up on a panel with Lawrence Watt Evans, and we had the most wonderful time talking about the history of science fiction, actually of fantasy.
I was going to say.
Huh?
I was going to say, yeah, fantasy more than science fiction.
Yeah.
The official topic was fantasy before Tolkien.
Yeah. And I had a wonderful joy of knowing a lot of the history of the fantasy field. And I figured I'd get 2 people on who really can talk about that and talk about what the joy is and why we do it. And the other, Lawrence Watt Evans, of course, is a well-known author who has written a lot of both fantasy and science fiction, more fantasy. And Brooks Peck was the curator at the Science Fiction Museum at the Museum of Popular Culture here in Seattle. And he's always pleasant to talk with. So I figured the 2 of them would be able to join me to talk about why do we read this? Why do we read the old stuff? Why do we bother? I mean, there's so much wonderful new stuff coming out right now. What does having read widely give us? We'll get into all sorts of other things as well, but I'd like to have each of them make an opening statement about that. What do you think? What do you think of that? Do you like reading the old stuff? Am I wrong?
Lawrence, you go ahead. I'm gonna get my thoughts.
I like reading the old stuff enough that I've been trying to write my own. And I grew up reading a lot of 19th and early 20th century adventure stories and decided the world needs more of that. So I invented Tom Derringer, and I'm 5 books into a series about an adventurer in the 1880s because I really loved reading that as a kid, and nobody else is doing it anymore. So
I think for me,
it's something I've enjoyed since I was 5. So I don't feel there's enough of the old. There isn't enough of the old stuff being written anymore. So I'm reading the old stuff that did get written and writing my own versions and just the simplicity is appealing to some extent, because there's just it's a simpler view of the world. You don't have to think about as many ramifications of everything. So I like that.
Yeah. I'm in a hotel, everyone, so I will occasionally have connectivity problems like just happened. So don't worry, I'll come back as quick as I can.
Okay. So Brooks?
And don't worry.
Yes.
Bob is always here.
Bob's your uncle.
Bob's like the man behind the curtain. He just comes and he goes.
Yes. Yep. He's the wizard. And we all know what that means. So Brooke, your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I mean, you're right, Tom. There is so much good new stuff as well, and almost too much to keep up with. But that's fun and exciting. But reading and appreciating the old stuff, it gives the new stuff legs, if you know what I mean. I really enjoy seeing the antecedents, seeing where stuff comes from. And when I read something new, I'm like, oh, I see where they're connecting. I see the foundations, although
As it
that's
were.
science fiction, yeah, as it were, the foundations of what's going on with that. And also, it's a dialogue. It's this sometimes very intense dialogue back and forth in fantasy, especially, but also science fiction as things move along. Before I forget, um, I wanted to ask Lawrence. You said you're still reading the old stuff. What are you
Yeah.
reading right now? What are you into right now?
Well, actually, right at the present time, I have been reading new stuff rather than old. But most recently, I've been reading the Action Figures Superhero Adventures by oh God, I forget his first name. Somebody Bailey, might be James Bailey.
I don't know it. So is that current stuff or old?
It's
Old?
current, yes.
Yeah, cool.
It's a series of maybe 8, and I'm two novels in.
I do a lot of rereading myself. And I'm
Oh yeah,
currently rereading the Martin Woodhouse and Martin Ross Medici Guns Emerald Hawks series, which are about a young and dashing Leonardo da Vinci in his early days, making things amazing in Italy. Woodhouse is a fascinating writer that almost nobody knows.
And when is that from? When was
Those are from the late 60s, early 70s.
American
Actually,
author?
early to mid 70s.
Yeah.
He was an original writer on the Avengers back in the very earliest days, and wrote most of the first season of Supercar. But he
I
also
remember
wrote,
Supercar.
yeah, he also wrote some of the best technology fiction out there. A series about a guy named Giles Yeoman who keeps falling into these difficult traps. And his conceit is he starts each of his novels in that series with the climax. He does an entire chapter at the most critical moment when everything's happening. In the first one, Yeoman wakes up and finds he's in this sort of coffin-like thing, but what he's actually doing is flying a supposedly pilotless drone plane. And then he spends the rest of the book getting back to how did he get there?
And so, does that first chapter resolve the climax, or is it sort of like a setup and cliffhanger?
It's a setup and cliffhanger.
Yeah. Super fun.
Yeah, and it's an interesting approach. And knowing about there are people who do approaches like that is one of the things that I love about reading the older stuff, is seeing different ways of doing the same things.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes me feel like that particular construct is more frequently seen in television. You know, there'll be sort of an opening and then just that thing. How did I get here? We want it back. It feels very very old serials. You know, the film serials.
Yeah.
Gives me that kind of vibe. It's very fun.
Yep. You do see it sometimes. You do see it still in TV. I don't remember seeing it in a recent novel for a long time now.
That's cool.
Maybe I'm just reading the wrong novels.
Yeah, well, I don't see it very often in novels, which is why I go back and reread stuff. And I keep finding odd things. I was rereading Cordwainer Smith recently.
Wow.
And when I reread in Australia, I discovered that he was one of the early people to have a highly positive trans character. In that one of the servants on the station that Rod McBan comes from in Australia is recruited to be a bodyguard for him and has her gender changed to male in order to look like him, and then decides she likes it and stays that way. And ends up becoming a Lord of the Instrumentality with the specific remit of looking at making sure that things are good for people who are ambiguously gendered.
Wow, that's a discovery. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of Cordwainer's short fiction. I have not read in Australia, though.
Yeah. Well,
That's a gap in my knowledge that I really ought to fill.
yeah, it worked well as two novels originally, Planet Buyer and I forgot what the other volume was titled. But they were a great deal of fun. And as I say, he's an amazing stylist.
Yeah.
One of the people in the comments has read Martin Woodhouse.
I'm really glad you bring up, because I was going to bring it up too, the idea of Smith as a stylist, because I find as time passes, I read a lot more for style than I used to. You know, when I was a teen, it was very idea focused, and so that's one of the things about some of the old stuff. And I don't want to like do that thing of just bluntly characterizing older SF and fantasy as being clunky, but sometimes the style is a little tough. People are figuring things out, you know. But yeah, Smith is more like a poet who's just doing these fantastical worlds. I think that's one of the reasons I go back to Jack Vance pretty frequently is style. He's you know, I think these days if AI were to sort of synthesize a typical Jack Vance plot, it would be like people fly to a planet and they have some coffee and talk about stuff, which sounds,
and something goes wrong,
right? Something goes wrong, and it's not that hard to solve. But the language, the wordplay, that I think is endlessly makes it rereadable and rereadable, because I'm obviously not there for I wonder what's going to happen. Vance, of course, is problematic in some ways, unfortunately, but a lot to be learned there, I think.
Yeah.
Well, he was very conservative in a lot of ways, and he was an odd fellow. Yes. So one of the people in the comments commented about Woodhouse's Bush Baby, which was also published in England, and originally published in England as Rock Baby.
It was?
Yeah, which is
okay.
The Americans often change with titles oddly.
So do the British.
Yes.
Going the other direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have a copy of Bush Baby. I don't know that I've ever actually read it.
Have you ever had one of your titles changed when it's been moved, Lawrence?
Okay. Yes. Of course.
It sounded as if you were speaking from experience.
Yes. In fact, there's one novel where it's been published by 3 different companies. And the first one, the editor didn't like my title, so he put on his own title. And the second one, the publisher didn't like either of those titles and put on a third one. And the third publisher, which is me, because I got the rights back when the second publisher shut down, I have self-published it now under both titles, so people can always find it. Same cover art, says on each one, also titled as. But yeah, it was originally published as Denner's Wreck, and then it was republished as Among the Powers, and it is now available under both those titles. But my original title was The Light of Another Sun. So,
okay, which sounds like a Jack Vance title.
Yeah, it's actually more. I can't, there's probably some Vance influence in there because there isn't everything, but it was really intended to be more of a Zelazny approach.
Well, Zelazny was strongly influenced by Vance too.
Well, yeah. We all influence each other. And
Lawrence, I do just want to say, like, I think that's cool how you've taken control there, but it's also an archivist's nightmare, trying to keep track of your volumes.
Yes, well, I am trying to make life easier for me and my readers, and frankly, archivists are pretty low on the priority list.
I'm going to out Karen.
How do archivists deal with the fact that A.E. Van Vogt wrote 2 different stories called The Monster?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, and also Murray Leinster wrote 2 different novels, one called The Time Tunnel and one called Time Tunnel.
Oof.
Yeah.
And there are the people who rewrite their stories every time. I will out Karen as being one of those. Every time something gets republished, it's a little bit rewritten. But Chip Delaney does that. There have been a few others, and I always sort of feel a little bit weird about that, because I wonder about the people who are going to discover it and discover, wait a minute, there's a different, this is different. But with Clark Ashton Smith, I think it was, I'm pretty sure it's The Double Shadow. The version that he originally published himself was completely different from the one that Arkham House published. It's a lot longer. I mean, the Weird Tales really abridged it. So, and Michael Kurland was sitting. It's one of his favorite stories, and he wanted to read it aloud. So I let him look at the copy of the original. He started reading it aloud. Wait a minute, this is much better. But you talk about stylists, Clark Ashton Smith.
Oh yeah, and
poet.
Several of the old fantasy authors, the pre-Tolkien ones, were amazing stylists, like James Branch Cabell and George MacDonald. They. One reason I loved George MacDonald when I was a kid is because I'd never read anything else that like his style. It was just so different.
The King of the Golden River, the Golden Key.
Princess and the Goblin was the one that I loved. And one of my sisters visited here and discovered I still had our dad's copy of Princess and the Goblin, and tried to talk me into letting her have it. And I said, no, I still have it. You can't have it. It's mine. I'm not giving it up.
I turned into a professional doing this. I need to keep it. It's reference material.
Besides, she actually had a chance to get it when we were clearing out our parents' house back in the 90s, and she did not grab it, and I did. So she had her shot and missed.
No takes backsies. Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is, of course, an interesting thing in terms of looking at the older stuff. There are often wonderful illustrations in the original editions and in some of the subsequent editions as well. There is a great joy to rereading a beloved copy. In a sense, I get a sense of history. There are a lot of books that I've never been able to read, except in when I finally get a first edition, I pick it up and I actually read it, as opposed to reading the paperback or something like that. When I was at UC Berkeley, I went to the rare book room and looked at the Kelmscott Chaucer, and I discovered that I'm one of the, probably like both of you, I tend to skim. I tend to read fairly quickly, get through a fair amount. And Chaucer kind of deludes me into thinking that I'm understanding it. So I get a page in and all of a sudden I realize I haven't been following what's been happening. And the Kelmscott Chaucer, it's in this typeface that William Morris designed that looks like German black letter. And the typeface slowed me down enough so that I could actually would read the whole thing rather than skipping from one word to the next. And from that, I said, hey, this is really good, as opposed to, this is that boring thing I had to look at in.
I have sort of a weird relationship with Chaucer because my mother majored in Germanic languages, specifically Middle English. So the first time I encountered Chaucer was her reciting it from memory while cooking lunch.
Wow.
In the original Middle English, of course.
Cool.
Yeah. How far could she go?
She could do the entire prologue and The Wife of Bath's Tale. I don't remember which of the stories, but she could do the entire prologue in one story from memory. And that was what she wrote her senior thesis on at Bryn Mawr. So.
Tom, I'm fascinated by this idea of how the typeface changed your reading experience, not just sort of like aesthetically, but slowing you down in things. I don't know. I don't know anything else to say. I'm not, I'm fascinated by typography, but I've never thought about it in context of fiction. To me, it's like, oh, it's just there to get the job done in fiction, but maybe not so. Maybe there's choices to be made there.
Well, there are choices to be made. I mean, with
Yeah.
the Tom Derringer books, because I wanted them to look Edwardian, I chose an Edwardian typeface, which I had to pay for. And anyway, they're all printed. I am sure 90% of the readers never notice, but it was important to me to have it look like something that could have been published in 1900.
What's the face, if you remember?
Hmm?
What is the typeface? Sorry to put you on the spot. It's just like,
yeah, I'm trying to remember.
It'll probably come back to you in 5
It
minutes.
will
and then
come
you
back
can-
to me at some inconvenient time, like 3:00 in the morning.
right.
Yeah.
But I can't remember what it
I
is.
love that. That's really cool.
But speaking of typefaces, there are some people who really like using display spaces.
Felice.
What is it?
Sorry, the type is Felice.
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 I can look that up.
Yeah. The Underwood Miller editions of Jack Vance, a lot of them used a somewhat ornate face that was not as easy to read as it might have been. Or you can look at what John Barry did in terms of typeface design for Little Big, the 25th, 40th anniversary edition. He did an amazing job. John is quite a text designer. And that's another case of a book where I tried reading it when it originally came out from Bantam, and it just kind of, I petered out. But I'm slowly working my way through this edition, and it's the typeface keeps me reading at the right pace. It's really hard to describe why that happens.
Interesting.
It's beautifully designed. It's very simple. It looks simple from the outside, but getting things like that right is incredibly difficult. There are real professionals out there who can do it, and there are a whole bunch of people who can almost do it, which is the Mark Twain thing. The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug.
Yep.
I'm not going to harp on typography forever, but you mentioned Jack Vance, and a few decades ago, there was this comprehensive set called the Vance Integral Edition.
Yeah.
And it was a completely fan-driven project, amazing project, and they decided to in fact design a brand new typeface purely for that project.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some dedication.
Was it at all a readable face?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. I mean, it's not like they went crazy or anything.
When people decide to do a new typeface, sometimes they get it wrong. I mean, Brenda Clough has a book in her library where I do not know the name of the author or the title because they are completely illegible.
Mm-hmm.
Simply cannot read them. I mean, first off, the cover has the title but not the author's name, and the typeface on the copyright page is such that you cannot read either one. So I have no idea who wrote it or what the title is.
Yes, that's the ornate black letter style faces can be very difficult. As I say, having to slow me down for reading Chaucer was in some cases it can be an advantage.
Yeah.
In some cases, yeah. Usually not.
Yeah.
And there's a friend of mine did a web comic where the font they chose for the dialogue was not a good choice. Very hard to read. It wasn't comfortable to read.
Well, so much of comics typography, as it were, is hand lettering.
Certainly used to be. Yeah.
Used to be anyway. I don't know that. Actually, no. I remember seeing an announcement by somebody that their new, their new personal project that was a labor of love that they were doing had been hand lettered, and it was the first thing he had hand lettered in 15 years.
Mhm.
So, I mean, he's a professional letterer, but everything had been done on a computer for 15 years. So, but his new one is done by hand, so some people are still at least giving it a shot.
Yeah, I remember that a lot of the comics that I liked less in the 60s that were, from relatively minor publishers used typed lettering, which was really annoying.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
not a good
jarring.
look.
That's jarring. Yeah, certainly. And
Well, when I forget either Marvel or Dark Horse, I think it was Dark Horse, when they were doing their early Conan comic books, the captions were done with a typeface that was deliberately chosen to look like a 1930s typewriter, because they wanted it to remind everyone, this is Bob Howard on his typewriter.
Yes.
I will say, and this might be blasphemous, but the Sandman comics, when the typeface would change for the different characters, and there was this sort of rainbow one, I think, for Dream, that kind of drove me crazy.
Delirium.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just sort of, my heart would sink every time I got to that character, because I would have to like slow down in a bad way and really puzzle it out. Now, part of that might be because I'm colorblind, so maybe it made it more of a struggle to read. But that was, for me personally, a case of art getting too artsy.
Yeah.
Well, there's a conflict between art and communication in many cases. You have to deal with it as writers. In that wanting to be a poet and a stylist does not necessarily move the story forward.
Right. It usually doesn't.
Yes. Which goes back to the old saying of kill your darlings.
Right.
Yeah. Another person from the 30s or so that people seem to have forgotten nowadays is Thorne Smith.
I don't know, every so often I'll see somebody posting about Thorne Smith and somewhere online, and half a dozen people will say who, but another half dozen will say, oh yes, that poor neglected genius. I don't know that he was a poor neglected genius, but he wrote some fun
He
stuff.
was not a poor neglected genius at the time. He was a bestseller.
Oh no, at the time he was a huge bestseller, but he's largely forgotten now. But then James Branch Cabell is largely forgotten now, or
Clark
Robert
Ashton
W.
Smith.
Chambers.
Yeah.
Robert W. Chambers, the people who have been swiping his stuff for the last 100 years are better remembered than he is.
Starting with Lovecraft.
Yeah, Lovecraft and Marion Zimmer Bradley. Although she is not remembered fondly at this point, she is still remembered.
But it's unrelated to the quality of her fiction, though.
Right, I know. But anyway, I mean, I was at a convention in, I think, Tennessee many years ago, where the conceit of one panel was to show up as your favorite author and try and present yourself as if you were that dead author. And I chose Robert W. Chambers, and somebody else on the panel that was Marion Zimmer Bradley, and the other panelists did not know that Bradley had gotten half her names and concepts from Chambers. So that was awkward, actually. Yeah. I managed to actually imitate Chambers's accent, even though I never heard him, and I don't think there were any recordings, because he was from the exact same place as my great aunt.
Interesting.
So I just
swear
her accent, and that worked.
What place is that?
The rich part of Brooklyn, back when there was one in the 1890s.
Okay.
Lawrence, can you do the accent now?
No, I've forgotten it. Aunt Nora's been dead a long time.
Some things stay with us, though.
Yeah, but not that. Sorry.
Yeah. Somebody just
And you,
commented.
it's an accent you will sometimes hear in movies from the early 30s,
Mhm.
because it was still what the New York upper crust spoke at that time. By World War II, it was dead. It was gone. But and it's not at all what anyone thinks of as a Brooklyn accent now, because that's from all the immigrants who came in the 20s. In the 1890s, it was still more Dutch than anything else.
Oh yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, local dialects are a difficult thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and most people have no idea how difficult. Most people think I don't have an accent. My freshman year at college in New Jersey, I heard somebody at the next table in the cafeteria talking, and I said, "Oh, you're from West Concord, Massachusetts, aren't you?" And he was, absolutely furious, and the rest of the table burst out laughing, and I didn't know why. Turns out he had just been arguing with his new roommates, saying, "I don't have an accent." And I was able to not only pin it down to the state or the town, but that it was from the west side of town.
Yes.
Amazing.
You know, it's something most people don't pay attention to this, but it's, if you do, one of my many sisters had a professor who could identify what county each of his students was from by having them say 12 words, and I don't remember what the 12 words are.
Mhm.
I had them written on the back of an IBM punch card
Punch card.
for years, but I've lost it. So,
I
but
love it.
anyway, yeah, I got my sister narrowed down to Middlesex County, Massachusetts, which was correct, but couldn't tell which town. So.
I grew up in New York, but my parents did not, so I of course do not have an accent. But
I grew up in Bedford, Massachusetts, but my parents were not from there and were determined I would not pick up that hideous New England accent.
yeah.
So I mostly didn't, unless I was talking to one of my friends, and then it would come out. And then when I was talking to my parents or anyone else, it would, I would become more generic again.
Mhm.
Yeah.
More the way I speak now.
One of my problems is that I tend to adapt how I'm speaking to fit my accent to the other person I'm talking to. If I'm talking to
Right,
a person.
right. Some of us do that.
Yeah, and there are people who claim I'm trying to mock them or
Mhm.
think that I'm
Oh,
being.
I totally embarrassed myself once. I was meeting a friend's Russian wife, and I started speaking with a Russian accent. She was so offended, and I wasn't doing it on purpose. I couldn't help it.
Yeah, it's completely reflexive.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that I'm thinking I'm doing. I just recognize that I've done it when it happens.
Where do you think that comes from? I wonder if that's, if that's some kind of human social adaptation thing, trying a way of showing people that you want to connect to them or you're friendly
Right,
to
that
them.
you're trying to blend in. You're not a stranger, or at least
Well,
not that much of a stranger.
one of the things that people tend to forget is that communication only generally works as an iterative process, that you have to keep going over things several times in order to get actual communications and get any precision at all.
Mhm.
That we try to say something and then end up, excuse me, getting it wrong. And then we have to go and correct it and retriangulate. People think that words have precise meanings, but they really don't. And accent is actually part of the context of communication. And so trying to approach the other person's context makes a lot of sense,
Mm-hmm.
at least to me.
Oh yeah. Communication in general is complicated. I mean, you have things like in China, there are at least 12 different languages that are considered Chinese,
Mhm.
and 11 of them are written exactly the same, but spoken really differently. The 12th is Cantonese, which has 8 tones and more characters than any other dialect of Chinese.
Mhm.
But they are different enough that you'll have people speaking to other Chinese, where they will draw a character on their hand because the pronunciation is so different, but they all write the same.
Hmm.
And then you'll also get cases where people who are allegedly speaking the same language can't understand each other. I was in a train station in Beijing once, and the person doing the announcements of what trains were loading was speaking in the lower class Beijing dialect, which is not the official Beijing dialect at all. It's what working class people in Beijing actually speak. It's got a very strong R glide, so a lot of words have, get slurred and all the consonants get replaced with R's. It's very weird. Anyway, it was alien enough that somebody stood up on a chair and started translating the announcements into the upper class Beijing dialect so that all the people from out of town could understand it.
Mhm.
He got a round of applause for that.
Yes. Yes. There are certainly British accents that are mutually incomprehensible.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Way back when, saw the first BBC adaptation of Cold Comfort Farm,
Mhm.
and it was introduced by Alastair Cook for an American audience, and he said, "And don't worry if you can't understand these thick South Country accents. Neither could most of the British audience."
Yes.
Yeah. Lawrence, I wanted to ask, have you read this nonfiction book, Kingdom of Characters?
No, I have not.
It's I actually, let me look. It's sitting over here. I think it's probably on my camera, but it's a recent book about the work of how to transmit Chinese language through technological means and the struggles to do that. So it starts with typewriters and telegraph and then gets into computers. And it's fascinating for anyone who's interested in language and technology. Super interesting book.
Yeah, I've never figured out how they do Chinese, how that people type Chinese characters. I mean, obviously it can be done. It is done, but I never figured out how it works.
And Japanese is in fact worse because between the kana and the kanji, you have several different ways to write the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you have katakana, hiragana, kanji, and romanji.
Yeah. I'm just fine with romanji, thank you.
I would hope so. But yeah, I gave up trying to any hope of learning Japanese when I found out about that. It's just like, that's ridiculous. I mean, Chinese is alien but understandable. Japanese, it's like that. I can't handle that.
The writing system, the language,
the writing
is actually
well. Also, the grammar is weird. But Chinese grammar is a lot like English. Japanese grammar is like backwards.
Yeah, but German grammar is completely different from.
No, it's old fashioned. I mean, I used to be fluent in German. I've forgotten most of it, and I never had much trouble. It actually made it easier for me to read older English stuff because English grammar used to be more like German.
Mm-hmm.
So, I never had trouble with the German grammar. I never understood why some people did, but it's there's a lot of variation in what people can deal with linguistically and what they can't. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, and probably those Germanic languages were imprinted on your tiny brain by your mother as a child.
Yes, and my mother was British, so that may have had something to do with it. I don't know.
Yes, and somebody in the comments that kanji in Japanese usually have two or more pronunciations.
They do, yes.
And that
and in Chinese you can have two or three different characters with the exact same pronunciation, and I've never, you have to in spoken Chinese you have to pick up which one it is from context. In writing, they look totally different.
Yeah.
So how many languages does Lawrence speak? One in several fractions. I used to be fluent in German. That was the only one I was ever fluent in, but I've forgotten all of it. But I have spent a few months in China because my son works in China. And my daughter used to work in China, but came back to the States. And I've always been fascinated by languages, so I picked up little bits and pieces of French and Italian and
Yeah.
a few others.
Fluent is one of those not very well-defined terms because, I could say I'm fluent in Latin, but I used to be able to speak it in a flowing manner, but now I don't.
Yeah. Well, my dad translated Russian professionally, and what he used to have to do, though, is he would have my mother actually read everything before he sent it out, because he knew that if he was thinking in Russian, he would tend to forget he would forget what English readers could actually follow. He would, and so he would write, and he had my mother read it, and it's like, is this fluent English?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
I like to say I have restaurant French. I have enough to get by in a restaurant.
But what I can say in French is je ne parle pas français.
Yeah.
Je suis désolé. Je suis désolé.
And wildly now French is changing. The French are always trying to resist changing their language, but what you just said, Lawrence, would be seen by young people as incredibly formal. The "ne" is dropping out.
I figure if you're explaining you don't know the language, formal is good.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true.
Yeah. When I was in Tokyo, I discovered that from going to a lot of Japanese restaurants, I had really good restaurant Japanese. Mm-hmm. I knew what a lot of things were that nobody else did. We were getting a gobo soup, and somebody said, "What's gobo?" And I said, "Burdock root." Doesn't everyone know that?
No, they don't.
No.
And of course, you can get fooled on that. I can't remember the Chinese name, but there is a Chinese name for a dish that my daughter discovered when she was living in China. It was just cheap comfort food, and she really loved it. It was an egg and rice dish where she got it. Mm-hmm. Then she was in Shijiazhuang, which is a city no Americans ever heard of, so don't worry if you haven't. But then she went traveling around China, and she tried ordering the same stuff and discovered that in about half of China, they'd never heard of it. And then the other half was a different dish in each city. Mm-hmm. It just happened to have the same name.
Yep.
So Karen was some surprises.
Vegetables, trying to buy oranges in Italy, and discovered that the word that she was using to ask for oranges means carrots to most Italians. So
okay.
And she kept putting hand in carrots and said, no.
I had one semester of Spanish in high school, and I discovered when we went to Spain that it was Mexican Spanish, and that they aren't the same.
No. Somebody was commenting in the chat, and I'm sorry, I can't read names in the chat. The lighting is terrible on my computer because of where I am. That for them, fluent means that they can think in the language. And that reminds me, the reason I could say that I was at one point fluent in Latin is because I started dreaming. I think dreaming in the language is a real sign of fluency.
Yes. I used to dream in German, and I could think in German, but it's all long gone.
We earlier were talking about pre-Tolkien fantasy and things like that. And since we're also talking about language, I love constructed languages, but I don't know of any examples that predate Tolkien. And I'm wondering if you guys...
Well, Esperanto.
Esperanto is what immediately came to my mind.
But in fantasy fiction, in literature.
In fantasy fiction?
Or even just a few words or something like that. I'm racking my brain.
I can't think of any either off the top of my head. Regarding every country, Lauren Davidson said every country in Latin America has a slightly different set of idioms and common use words. Mm-hmm. About 20 years ago, we were having our house painted, and we hired this Peruvian fellow who had a good reputation, and he showed up with a crew of 8 from 6 different countries. speaking 6 different dialects of Spanish, and therefore they would mix in words from English because, for example, screwdriver. Somebody needed a screwdriver to open a can of paint, and I don't remember the Spanish phrasing, but he, does anybody have a screwdriver? And he said screwdriver in English, and I asked about that, and it's because they had 6 different words for screwdriver from their 6 different languages, and they didn't know each other's.
Yeah. When Karen was working on the iTunes Music Store launch, she discovered there were 12 different ways to spell Tchaikovsky.
Oh, wow.
Well, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In,
Oh, yeah.
in what they were trying to import.
Have you ever seen the name Khrushchev, the Soviet premier?
Yeah.
If you've seen it in Russian, it's like 6 or 7 letters, and in English, it's, I don't know, 8 or 9. I haven't counted lately. In German, it's 13 because of just the way the phonetics work in the various languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 6 letters in Russian and more than that in English and 13 in German.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, transliteration is completely different from translation.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
This is actually something that comes up in my work when we're translating printed materials, and just the difference of translating from English to whatever language, how much space we need to allot. Something like Spanish, kind of 1 for 1. Translating to German, we need to leave a lot more room because it's bulkier, much bulkier.
One of my novels translated into German had to be put in 2 volumes.
Oh, wow.
So it didn't fit in one, and whereas in English it fit just fine.
Yeah. And Japanese can be a lot less bulky. I expect Chinese too. Ideographic languages often take up less space.
Well, yeah, because it's
You're putting an entire word into one character.
Yeah.
And another commenter was about put a Spaniard, a Mexican, and an Argentinian in the same room. I went to college with a guy from Puerto Rico and a guy from Cuba. They didn't get along because they kept thinking the other one was deliberately acting dumb because their versions of Spanish were so different.
Yes. Yeah.
And, Cuba and Puerto Rico are like right next to each other practically. But they had gone very different directions linguistically.
Yes.
So
Various people.
Go ahead, Tom.
I was going to change subject, but you were on subject, so continue.
I was just going to say the first time I heard Quebecois French, because I was taught Parisian French, it sounded like a practical joke to me. No offense to the Quebecois, I understand that's the way the language works, but to my ears, Quebecois sounds like French with a very bad American accent.
Well, my wife's mother was French Canadian, and so Julie learned some Canadian French as a little girl, and then when she started taking French in high school, she discovered that no, that's wrong. In France, when she went to France in 1971, when she was 15, she discovered that no one in France would admit to being able to understand her French.
Yeah.
Yeah. Several of the people in the discussion got into talking about Tarzan and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, I've never been able to read Burroughs. There are some people who just really love him. Are either of you big Burroughs fans? And if so, what is it about Burroughs?
I used to be. That was something that when I was in my teens, I read not all the Tarzan books because there's a lot, but I read all the Mars books and most of the Tarzan books by the time I was 30. And when I go back and try to reread them now, it's like, not interested. I mean, it's not that I can't, it's just there's nothing there that I feel any need to revisit.
I'm like you, Tom. I found Burroughs to be a slog. I sure wanted to like Burroughs, especially as a teen where you're just trying to find more stuff to read, and there's this whole Mars series that seems super exciting. I've never analyzed why it just wasn't my vibe.
Well,
But stylistically, I I think for me back then he was kind of clunky. It felt old to me in not a good way. Maybe maybe I should try it now, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was always a Doc Smith fan, and the world seemed to be divided between the people who liked Doc Smith and the people who liked Burroughs. I've actually reread some Doc Smith, and yes, there are problems with it, but it's still a good story.
Well, one problem with Burroughs is if you're starting off with the Martian series, A Princess of Mars starts really slowly. About halfway through the book, the pace finally picks up, and that's where it really gets fun. But I admit, the first half of Princess of Mars is a slog. It just is. I don't know what happened there. But once he really got into it and he felt he didn't need to explain everything in detail every time, it picks up. It gets a lot better.
Well, the early Terry Pratchett is just joke fiction, but later on he turns into something, doing something that is unlike what anyone else was doing, and it's brilliant
and deeply philosophical and satirical.
Yes,
Pratchett is someone I can go back to over and over.
But the first, definitely the first two, and probably about the first 5 of the Discworld novels are really, they're fun, but they're nothing very special at all. But then he finally got the hang of it.
Yeah.
Oh, Cheryl Alexander there. I met somebody in college who I thought was English, and it turns out she was from deep in a hollow in West Virginia.
Wow.
She did speak pretty much 17th century English. And it was so strange listening to her and finding out she was from West Virginia, because she really sounded British.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things about the Appalachian culture, of course, is that the music, the songs got brought over from England, but they tended to take out the supernatural elements that had been there in the British English and turn them into something that was much more, normal.
Mundane, I think is
Mundane.
the word.
Mundane is the word I was looking for, yes. Which is a fascinating thing to look at in terms of what gets carried with musical traditions as well. There's certainly enough fantasy in music over the years, but we see less of it now.
Yeah.
I can't help wonder if early settlers in that area, if life was just so scary, they really didn't need more folklore, more ghosts and things like that, so they had to pull that out of their songs.
Or it could
they
be
still sang murder ballads.
Yeah, it could be a religious,
that's possible.
People translated it out of this weird devil stuff. Somebody commented that they had Dune on their shelf for a long time and then didn't read it because it started so slow.
Yeah.
I get that. I certainly get that. With Burroughs, I was super excited when they did a Mars film about 10 plus years ago. I was really hopeful that would translate well and be interesting, and that was a little disappointing. but also getting back to languages, for the film, they did create a whole Martian language, and then scrapped it and never used it ultimately, just little bits, which is a bummer because the creator put a ton of work into it.
If you actually go and read Burroughs, he invented an ape language and he invented a Martian language, and why only one Martian language is a question that might be gone into, but I'm not going to bother. But the thing is, he didn't know enough about linguistics to actually do a half decent job of either one. In every case, it's just, here's this word, tar. It's exactly equivalent to the English white. things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
There's no shades of meaning. The grammar is just like stripped down English grammar. It leaves out the articles, but other than that, it's basically English grammar for both Martian and ape, because he just didn't know enough and he didn't care enough. I mean, he just put in the words he did to provide a little exoticism.
That's a good example of a pre-Tolkien.
Yeah. There
Right.
you go.
Then you've got Klingon, which was invented by hobbyists for the movies, and it's a real viable language that reflects the Klingon culture as seen in the movies. And I mean, I've had some of my stories translated into Klingon, which is weird, but it's true. And apparently one of them, they got about halfway through, and then the people doing the translating got into an argument over how to translate one sentence that just didn't work in Klingon. So they never finished it.
Well, there's one of my favorite stories about Klingon is that a group embarked on translating the Bible, but then they too got into an argument. One side wanted to translate the Bible into Klingon sort of as is. The other side wanted to make the concepts a little more Klingon. So there was, in fact, a Klingon Bible schism, and two versions were ultimately made.
I love that, because it
Klingon Protestants.
Yeah.
I under a different pen name, I adapted, I novelized a comic book miniseries from the Predator series, Predator Cold War, and I was reading the comic books and I realized two things about the guy who scripted the original comic books. One was he had never been out in sub-zero temperatures in his life. His descriptions of sub-zero weather were just flat out wrong. And he's from Southern California, so where would he have been? And the other thing was he clearly didn't know a word of Russian. There was one word balloon in the comic book where I was looking at it, and I don't know a lot of Russian, but I know just a little. And I was looking at it and realizing you literally cannot say any of that in Russian. Mm-hmm. There was an entire balloon supposedly in Russian where there was only one word in it that actually has a Russian equivalent, because Russian doesn't have articles, and the interrogative words are totally different. And just I'm reading this and it's like, it's not possible to say that in Russian. So, and he had no idea because he didn't know Russian. So
yeah, the comment on the side that made me laugh was they should have translated the Bible into Ferengi.
Yes, there you go.
That makes much more sense.
Yeah, hyper
it would have been
Bible.
The Bible in Ferengi would have been a really different document.
Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount would have been amazing.
Yes. Yeah. A transactional language.
Yep.
Well, we're getting very close to our end of time.
Oh, we are. Oh my goodness.
We've taken up just close to an hour on this already, which is
it
doesn't really feel like it, does it? That's what I like.
No, and it's been on a lot of different subjects rather than what we were normally going to be speaking about. But,
exactly. That's what I like doing with these. I like just having a good conversation with people who are very knowledgeable and who know a bunch of stuff that I don't know, or that I know enough about to ask good questions. And
I know I know a little bit about all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You want something in depth, I'm not your guy probably, but I can converse semi-knowledgeably on a lot of topics.
Yeah.
Which is why I became a fiction writer, because you can always find a way to use this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And Brooks, of course, became a librarian / archivist / curator for similar reasons.
And being a curator is a lot like it has a similar mode in that you need to sort of get up to speed on all kinds of topics. Some of which you choose, some of which you don't choose, and it keeps you moving, which I really like. Keeps you moving.
It's a form of translation.
Mm-hmm. I teach.
I guess
I teach this and I talk about that all the time, that it's interpretation. Here's everything you need to know about being a curator. It's not about information. It's about interpreting that information for your audience. And writing is, of course, I think, an interpretive process.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know. It's a collaborative process where you were taking a story from your head and translating it for the rest of the world. So, but yeah, I mean, the Tom Derringer stories are set in the 1880s. I have spent more time researching the 1880s than I actually have writing the books. And I'm sure that nobody really cares about the railroad timetables from Omaha to Ogden, Utah. But I looked them all up, and I know I got them right, and that matters. But I got them right.
Well, of course, the problem with the railroad timetables early on was that there weren't uniform time zones.
Yeah, by 1883 there were.
Yeah,
By 1883, the railroads, although they weren't the current time zones.
Yeah.
But they would note on the schedule that this section of the run is on Omaha time, or whichever city they chose as their basis, and it would vary from one route to another what time they used. But yeah, the central. Okay, yeah, the Central Pacific did in fact use Omaha time for the western half of the route. So I don't know why Omaha, but that's what they used.
That's cool.
See, now there's a fact you didn't know, and you didn't know you didn't know it, and you didn't care.
I want to know, where do you find railroad timetables from the 1800s?
From railroad memorabilia collectors on the web. They will post pictures of their prizes, and you can blow them up and read them.
And did you ever sort of reach out and be like, hey, I'm trying to find this thing. Has anyone got it?
Yeah, but it never worked.
Yes, this is one of the real problems of research, is nobody ever has exactly the thing you want.
Yeah. I love that.
But we are theoretically over time here.
Yep. So Bob will be coming on shortly. Any summing up that either of you wishes to do?
Just, I am fascinated by the way the world used to be that it isn't anymore. And that's one reason I love reading all the old stuff and seeing how their viewpoint of the world is different from ours. And other languages, viewpoint of the world is different from ours.
Yeah. The strong form of the superior hypothesis doesn't work, but anybody who says the language you speak in doesn't affect the way you view the world hasn't paid attention.
Right.
And I would say, getting back to our original topic, that fantasy, especially fantasy 150 years old, is also an interesting way to study how people were thinking about the world by thinking about other worlds. I mean, that's, of course, a reflection about how they view their own world. And that's a really neat thing to see.
Yes, translating.
Nobody has ever tried translating 1880s railroad timetables into No. I think I can probably.
I wouldn't be certain of that. People have tried all sorts of things, and sometimes it fails.
I have seen a Klingon cookbook, and most of those recipes wouldn't work. But then I am not one, but I have met people who are fascinated by really old cookbooks, pointing out that the assumptions of what foods you have available are so different. There's a recipe, famous medieval recipe for rabbit stew that begins, first catch a rabbit.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and now we have Bob back to try and
Bob.
Oh, I've just been watching and listening. This has been a fascinating show. The Bible in Ferengi. Oh, there's a You saw my note. That would be the Joel Olstein Bible. The but first of all, thank you guys very, very much. You were very interesting, and it was a great conversation. So thank y'all. Now, as you had me looking up for a moment while you were talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs and the writing of that era, because as a kid, my access to books was very limited to older books. So I can tell you about Horatio at the Bridge. But when I got to buying books, one of the first sets I bought was the Tarzan books uh, and the Conan books. So that was a pleasure listening. Now, one of the things that's going on at BQ Press is we're doing a new anthology. As many of you know, there was an election here.
Oh, there was? Did I miss that?
About 7 million Americans that shouldn't have missed it did. And you can take all the conspiracy theories in the world, but we had a bunch of whiny butts that stayed home. And to them, I have a one word, and it isn't good job, because that's 2 words. But so that inspired us. We're doing an anthology. We originally called it Retribution and Revenge, because that was what we were promised, 4 years of retribution and revenge. How can we forget the I am your retribution line? But we grew up a little bit after our anger abated and found ourselves calling it Alternative Liberties. Now, it is a great book, and I wanted to. The reason I'm bringing it up because there's only 13 days left to submit, and if you get in this book, you're in with some wonderful people. We're taking poems, we're taking essays, and short stories. And as the guy who is forced to make the final decision, I will tell you, I like humor a lot, and I like redemption. You know, so think about it. If you're there, we're out on Moksha, or you can just email me your story, and I'll see if I can get somebody to put it on Moksha. And Tom, you know one of our editors.
Gee, yes. The question that I would have in terms of that is, are you taking reprints as well as originals?
We are taking reprints rarely. It's such a current topic. There are so many dystopian people who have written about dystopia, but we find that most of we have accepted very few reprints, and but we will take them if they really rock. But one of the other things is reprints tend to be from more well-known writers, and one of the things that I am very proud of what we do at BQ Press is you don't have to be a well-known writer to sell us a story. You know, yes, I will admit it helps if your name is Harry Turtledove and you've got a story that is dead on. You know, wow, okay, duh, yeah, of course I'm going to buy it. But I will tell you, we have people who we have bought in multiple times. It has been the first time they ever submitted a story anywhere. And we liked it and bought it because we also like fresh, you know, and fresh helps. And speaking of fresh, Lauren Davidson is in the audience today. I saw a couple of his comments, and I wanted to call out a congratulations to him because he's our latest acceptance. I was sitting here when the show started, sending an acceptance out, and then I saw his name pop up on the comment section. He wrote a story that It made a certain editor cry. I won't mention her name, Tom,
Hmm.
but she when she said that, knowing her, I accepted the fact that it was probably good, and then I went and read it and decided it was really good, and so we bought it. But that's the beauty of this is getting to see lesser. I don't know. Lauren seems to be one of those growing talents. For all I know, he's got 3 nebulas by now. Uh, but I'm just going to go with the fact that I hadn't heard of him, and I thought he did a good job. Uh, so that said, this book is going to be out. We're publishing it sometime before noon on January 20th. Because we want to beat the executive order that says you cannot publish anything critical
Critical of the administration. Yeah.
of our dear leader, and we figure it'll take him at least 20 minutes. He's already got lawyers out there that are trying to prevent the publication of books critical to him. And so then I'll close that little sermon and pitch with we give, our writers give. Sometimes they donate part of their fees and a section of our profits go. So sum total is BQ Press and its writers have given over $6,000 to the ACLU. And we plan on continuing to do that. And this book is one of the ways we make it possible. So thank you guys who are writing for submitting, and those of you who are on this show for helping keep the BQ Press name out there, because I think we're doing good work, and you guys make it possible. And then people like Tom, who comes here once a month and hasn't yet said to me, Bob, you've got to fire my wife. She's fire Karen. She's spending too much time on this damn book. But it's fun. So, like Tom said earlier, any last minute things that you suddenly realized you wished you'd said?
I'll just say congrats on the anthology. It sounds amazing.
Well, cool. Well, anthologies are fun. As Phyllis Irene Radford told me once, it says, Daw used to put the anthologies out once in a while simply for the sake of getting their authors, their novelists' names out there and letting people see a slightly different side of them. And I can see that because I read novels by a lot of these writers, and I would have never said, oh, wow, you wrote this, and it works out pretty good. So thank you very much, all of you, and we will be back in a week, and be having you guys thrilled to death with Cliff Winnig, and he's bringing his guests. Cliff is a wonderful. He's also one of the editors of the book, by the way. So I don't leave anybody out. Deborah Reinert, Deborah Godfrey, also known as that, and Cliff Winnig, Lou J. Berger, K.G. Anderson, myself, and Irene Radford. We have, when you say you're going to put out an anthology on January 20th, that you put an open call out on November 9th, that's a tight schedule, and you need all the talent you can get. And these are some talented people we've got in as editors. So thank them, and thank you all for showing up.
Well, and I also want to say thank you, Lawrence and Brooks, because I've really enjoyed talking with you. And I know we're all going to talk more later in the future. Thank you.
God,
it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, bring these guys back. I mean, hell, the linguistics conversation alone was worth it. Because you talked about adopting an accent. If you're listening to, I almost got my ass kicked once in Australia over that exact topic.
Oh, yeah.
And anyway, I was in the Navy. That wasn't an uncommon occurrence. So thank you all.